Welcome to another edition of Breakpoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to explore the big stories of the week from the perspective of Christianity through a Christian worldview. That's what we do here at the Colson Center. It's something I believe is more important today than at any other time in my admittedly brief lifetime. John, I think we're going to...
You are a young guy, Shane, so it's important to start by saying, but I would say the same thing, and that adds another decade at least to the time frame.
Well, thank you, John. I know people always say that when they see me for the first time, they say, you sound way older than you look. So I don't know whether to consider that a compliment or an insult, but I usually take it as a compliment. I think we're going to look back on this year potentially, and it's always dangerous to make these kinds of predictions, but I think we could look back on this year as the low point maybe of the last 10 years. It's just been a week of absolute turmoil. And that came with, of course, images. There was a powerful opinion piece that I really liked by Joe Ferrullo at The Hill. And he surveys how past chapters in American history have been kind of defined by single images, these photographs that just emerge out of riots and wars and political turmoil and so forth, and how the public reactions and even policies have actually flowed from those images. And he raises the really good question of which image is going to come out of 2020. Is it going to be the unarmed George Floyd as the officer, kneels on his neck, killing him? Or is it going to be the ensuing riots and the property destruction and even destruction of life that ensued from that?
Well, Andy Crouch had a tremendous article this week, and Andy's been a really helpful commentator. In fact, after we record this, and I think it's important to note, Shane, that we're recording this on Thursday afternoon. Most people are going to hear this on Friday, some a little bit later, and we don't always kind of mention when we're recording it, but the stories are moving so fast and new things are developing moment by moment that I think it's important to acknowledge that. And just after we finish this recording, Andy and Pastor Chris Brooks of Woodside Bible Church in Detroit, former board member of the Colson Center, dear friend, just a wonderful pastor and thinker, are going to join me for a live webinar that's part of our Truth, Love, Together event. And I want to get back to the opinion piece here by Joe Ferrullo. Is that how you say his name? Ferrullo,
yeah, I think so.
Something like that.
I think so.
I'm going to get back to that in just a second. But our Truth, Love, Together event was put together, in response to having to cancel the Wilberforce weekend. The theme of that was decided a year ago, and here we are, the third session. After talking about what is truth and what is love, the third module is how do we become people of truth and love. And Andy Crouch did a tremendous presentation that people can watch, and we'll link to that. And especially asking the question, what kind of people does the world need right now? And I emailed him, last week and said, obviously we can't address questions about your session without specifically relating it to the events of the week, which he obviously quickly agreed and graciously agreed. And we've got questions pouring in already for that session, which again will go live before many people even hear this broadcast. And I bring that up because he also pointed out something I think really powerful in an article this week. We'll also link to that in the show notes. That too much information is a bad thing, and we need more context and probably less news stories.
That was a great article. And he calls out the idea that we all have to respond individually to each
and every
right?
news article, which is exhausting. Shane,
Yeah.
I'm doing this, and I'm just going to be honest. I'm exhausted. We spent Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And look, this is a first world problem. I am not putting my troubles up against anyone, but I think I have a very comfortable life. But trying to make sense of this has been not only exhausting, it's been painful. It's been hard. Trying to navigate the questions, folks who are going to stick around for the kind of the bonus segment in the podcast where we take questions. We're going to take some really hard questions, people that were very upset with some of the commentaries on Breakpoint that we did, and we'll talk about some of those. But it has to do with this point that Andy makes, which is the point of this op-ed piece about the image that will define our future. Images have changed the course of history. Emmett Till, the image of the Chicago young man who was lynched in Money, Mississippi, back in the 50s. Rosa Parks actually pointed to that image, and that image went beyond even what motivated her to take the stand that she did. They have the image of the young girl in Vietnam,
Right.
who had just her
Burned
village had
by the
just been
napalm.
napalmed.
Yeah.
And,
Tiananmen
and
Square.
yeah, and you
Eggman.
know, Tiananmen Square. That's exactly right. And we could just go one by one by one. The thing that concerns me is that these images are always interpreted,
Mm-hmm.
right? So both the image of George Floyd and the image of the riots that we have seen and the violence that we have seen break out are going to be interpreted through the lens, and that's a culturally contingent sort of thing.
It is.
Not all cultures see images the same way. So his point of which image, and also I think it underscores something else, Shane, which is Americans are pretty bad at holding two images together at the same time, or two narratives, or two stories,
or two truths together at the
or
same time. Right.
yeah.
Which is, we should admit, part of that mental exhaustion that comes from consuming a news cycle that past generations never had to consume because they didn't have such quick connectivity as we have. So we're all expected to just render an opinion on everything, especially in the age of social media. And if we don't, then we must be complicit with things. But we should be able to, I think, do two things. First of all, we need to be able to turn the news cycle off long enough to just be still and contemplate, and pray about what's going on in the world. Prayer is the most important thing because it's in God's hands, right? It's not our responsibility ultimately to solve individually all the problems of the world. But the second thing is to hold the truths together, to walk and chew gum at the same time, as you like to say, to be able to say that we affirm all goods, or all truth rather. We affirm justice as a nonpartisan issue. We believe that what's right is right, and it doesn't matter who happens to be advocating for it at any given moment, or I should add, any other direction they want to take that narrative. If it's right, it's right, and we should be willing to affirm that.
So the truths that we have to affirm even make it more complicated from a Christian worldview.
Now you're
The
going to get
Christian worldview.
specific. Well, I wasn't going to get controversial.
No,
But
yeah, it's much easier to stay back. But but there are two
truisms.
truths. There are two truths, two realities that are absolutely essential if we're going to be able to navigate the challenges of our culture. The first is the thing that hopefully broke all of our hearts when we saw an unarmed George Floyd being brutally treated in a way that eventually, as at least the coroner reports, two of the coroner reports that have come out suggest ended his life. And that is every single person is made in the image and likeness of God. And there is a history of this in this country of not affirming that among Christians, by the way, not to mention among policy makers and so on. But also the fall affects every single person. There are not some people that are blameless and some people that aren't. And the lens of critical theory, one of our What Would You Say videos, actually two of our What Would You Say videos over the last month, way before all this, dealt with this idea of critical theory. And critical theory draws this line of these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. And these are the good guys because of some thing other than their decisions, other than their character, other than their will. They're the good guys because they belong to a class that has been considered oppressed. They're the bad guys because they belong to a class that is considered to be oppressors. And everything, is to be seen through that lens. Shane, you're probably tired of hearing me say this because I've said it at about 75 of our editorial meetings over the last year. I've said it on Breakpoint, I don't know how many times, including earlier this week. I continue over and over and over to go back to the importance of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's speech, A World Split Apart, at Harvard. And one of the things that Solzhenitsyn said elsewhere, but alludes to in that speech is, that we want to think that there are the bad guys there. Mm-hmm. And if only we could round up the bad guys, then that would take care of the problem. But the line between good and evil runs right down the middle of the human heart. I can't remember
Which is
another
what critical
time.
theory tries to escape, the idea that we can just draw a line down the middle of humanity and say, well, if you're on this side of the line, you're of this particular race or class or sex, you're oppressed, and then you are among the good guys by default just because of who you are. And then there are other people who are oppressors, and they're the evil ones. They're where the evil comes from. And that's probably the core flaw of the idea, is that it's too simple. It underestimates the reality of the fall in every human heart, and the fact that those motivated by a desire for justice can then turn around and smash windows and kill people and destroy property and lives because they're so angry. And that's wrong. But that's because depravity is in every human heart. It's not just in the bad guys over there.
Yeah, and speaking of people with sin natures, if you're hearing a big thumping, it's my son upstairs that's running back and forth, probably violating the commands of my wife to be still.
Well, that's okay. My son decided today he wanted to be a pirate, and I had to. Well, I haven't yet, but I have to explain to him that pirates make a living a certain way, and he can't really do that, but he can dress up as one if he likes.
If he likes to, but that same mistake that you just attributed to critical theory, which was right, is also made on people who, as we put it, I think in two different commentaries this week, want to immediately retreat to political or ideological corners in order to understand the brokenness of the world. When you do that, your side might be more right on more things than the other side, but to think that you're right because it's your side is making that same mistake that Solzhenitsyn was trying to keep us from making. And the other thing he talked about was, kind of the instability. We have seen a lawlessness revealed. And I want to go back to something, too, we've said before, which is, we said it, I think, initially in regards to COVID-19, that there are pre-existing conditions to our cultural moment that COVID-19 hasn't created but has revealed. And that's more true now about the injustice done to George Floyd, the other instances that we've seen of police brutality. And that's a hard thing to say because I'm a pro-police guy. Most police officers give their lives. They're remarkable individuals. Yeah. The institution in and of itself is not only not bad, it's necessary. The irony here, Shane, is that it's increasingly necessary in a lawless society. And this is one of the things that troubled me this week by the law and order folks, of which I would consider in many ways myself part of that group, saying that, the solution to this problem is kind of running over the violence. When you're a society where you have to keep order by force, in which people can't govern themselves, then additional militarization is not the solution. It's not a solution to the problem. It's an indicator that the problem is really, really bad. And the lawlessness that is so deeply rooted. My wife and I were having this conversation this week. Just this tendency we've had as Americans for so long to decide which laws we're going to obey and which laws we're not. This is we've seen that in the church, right? Which part of the Bible are we going to hold as sacred, and which part of the Bible are we not going to hold as sacred? That was that was part of one of the commentaries that I gave this week, and I take you had nothing to do with that. Neither did any other writer have anything to do with that. And we're going to address it later on in the Q&A. But there's so much of what we're seeing that, is Chuck Colson would say, is downstream from the culture.
We're going to talk more about this particular issue when we come back right after this. Folks, you're listening to Breakpoint This Week. Stay with us. We're back on Breakpoint this week talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, one of the big controversies this week that reemerged, and it seems to reemerge just about every time there is an instance of police brutality, particularly when it's racially charged, is the question of whether there is systemic racism in the police force. And you mentioned just a moment ago that you consider yourself a pro-police guy. And I would say the same thing. I mean, the vast majority of officers are really good people. And I think that the idea of systemic racism doesn't even necessarily contradict that the officers in question are very good people. But there was a Trump administration official in particular this week. It was the National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien, told CNN that he said, no, I don't think there's systemic racism. I think 99.9% of our law enforcement officers are great Americans. And there was a lengthy Washington Post piece that I actually posted on Facebook this week, and it really riled people up. But it was a collection from a couple of years ago. Another of these incidents sparked it, actually, of over 90 studies that analyzed different components of the law enforcement structure, and found pretty strong evidence that there is racial bias at work. There is a and there are many instances in which African Americans are just treated differently in the policing system and the criminal justice system. And so that's something that's very painful and difficult to acknowledge, but it's one of the core complaints at the root of this whole debacle, right? This is not just about George Floyd, even though, as we mentioned earlier, that was the image that set things off. This is about a more systemic claim. It's a much bigger idea that there's an injustice in the U.S. that African Americans are suffering. So what do we do with that as Christians? How do we think about this?
Well, we have to think clearly about it. All right. So let's go a step back from racism to sin and ask, is sin personal or systemic? And are the effects of sin just personally felt, or are they systemically felt? And the answer is yes. In fact, we would say this ourselves, that we feel, for example, as Christians, that there is a systemic attempt to rid the religious symbolism, religious activity from the public square, right? You're not allowed to pray in public school. That's a systemic issue. That's not to say that every single teacher believes that, although there are some that do.
Right.
But it's just to acknowledge that unbelief and the consequences of unbelief and sin itself can be both personal and systemic. So let's grant that as a category, then to look at a particular sin like racism. And I want to go to the quote that you just quoted from National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien. And let me be really careful, because I'm trying to be very charitable to everybody right now, because you can hold up a quote from anybody and make it seem like, they're an idiot or that they don't understand it.
We talked about this last week, being charitable. And to be clear, this is quoted by CNN, and I'm sure that CNN has a bunch.
Right, I'm going to be quoted. I'm going to be charitable to CNN, and just
right.
But at the same time, I want to talk about this quote because it actually gets to the heart of, I think, of how people misunderstand what we mean when we say the systemic nature of evil, whether we're talking about racism or anything. So here's the quote: "I don't think there's systemic racism. I think 99.9% of our law enforcement officers are great Americans, and they're African American, Hispanic, and Asian." See, the problem with this analysis, and again, I'm not saying this is his, because it may not be his, it may have just been a misquote or an uncontextualized quote, is to think that those two things are incompatible. That you can have 99.9% of people, law enforcement officers, who have great intentions, who aren't racist in and of themselves, don't have any personal feelings of racial bias or anything like that. They're great Americans. They want to do the right thing. They want to do their job the best way they know how, and so on and so on and so on. And so therefore there can't be systemic racism. But see, that's exactly misunderstanding the systemic nature of evil. In our book, A Practical Guide to Culture, we talked about the difference between cultural waves and cultural undercurrents. The cultural waves are the ones you feel. The cultural undercurrents are the things you don't feel. They're the realities under the surface. You scuba dive all the time, right? You go down and look for prehistoric teeth. This is what Shane does. Yeah. The cat's out of the bag. This is what Shane does on his days off, which he takes a lot of them. And he goes and dives under the water looking. No. I'm just teasing about that.
Yeah, I take a lot of Saturdays off, John.
Yeah. Who said you could have Saturdays off? So
that's like what Chuck Colson used to say. Oh, what do you mean you're taking a vacation? You had a vacation last year.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. I sympathize with his impulse there. But the thing about the systemic nature of evil is that it goes unnoticed. It gets embedded in systems, and it can actually go unnoticed by people who have really wonderful intentions. This is just the way that systemic evil kind of gets into our blood and gets into our system. Now, the hard part too is that this is also complicated by conclusions, particularly when it comes to race and law enforcement and criminal justice, that goes beyond the evidence. The evidence that you cited has to be interpreted, and you cited, it's a Washington Post article, it's a couple of years old, and it just goes down all kinds of categories where the outcomes incongruous, right?
Yeah,
What
policing
happens with
rates,
white.
profiling, pullover rates, escalation, arrest,
It's an
prosecution.
amazing
Yeah,
set of statistics. Yeah, if for nothing else, you should go look at it, and we'll link to it. Uh, Again, it's just data, and the
right.
data then has to be interpreted. One way that it's been interpreted has been then this idea of what's called a new Jim Crow thesis, that
Mm.
the criminal justice system was basically used to create a new system of inequality and that sort of thing. I think that that's an overstatement of what the evidence shows. And I'm grateful for my friend Chris Brooks, who will be again with us right after this for a live conversation. And that audio will be available on our website and other places. But also Anthony Bradley at the King's College, who's written extensively at this. Not by the way, both African Americans who are looking at this. Basically, and I think particularly Anthony Bradley tends to be just rabidly honest, right? I mean, that's gets him in trouble on Twitter more than once, but he will refuse to come to a conclusion that he doesn't think the evidence leads to, and this is one of those cases. At the same time, he would say that how arrests take place.
Mm-hmm.
The thing, one of the things, how quickly arrests escalate, the presumptions of what someone is doing. And then you also have, of course, the reality that oftentimes the context, the cultural context, the zip codes where this is happening are zip codes where there's a greater amount of danger and there's a greater amount of crime. And to say that cops don't racial profile, I think most cops would say they try not to, but they end up doing it.
Yeah.
And so all of this gets put into this mix.
You also have to deal with the issue of generational damage from racism. So it may very well be in many cases that the police are doing their level best to go out there and be equitable in the way that they police black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods. The problem, John, is that we know that there's a strong relationship between family breakdown and crime, not just poverty and crime, not just, race and crime or any of these other factors. And so we've got generations of people in a community where many of the fathers are incarcerated or are not present. And that just continues this cycle of crime. So they're going to get over policed, at least statistically, as a result of that. But if you have to go back into American history and ask the question, why has this state of events come about? Why is this condition afflicting African American communities? Well, at least part of the answer is that slavery was the most anti-family institution in the history of the West.
Now that's something that I said this week in a Breakpoint commentary, that legacy of slavery, if we think it's going to go away or this is stuff you get over, there was something uniquely wrong about the way the British did slavery and the Spanish did slavery, and then how that carried over into the American context and the intentional separation of the family. It's a remarkable thing that the family emerged kind of during the Jim Crow era, in particular, as strong and as stable as it did in the African American community. And then you had another issue,
right?
And again, what we're trying to say is you can't just pull out one of these stones and clear up the water, right? I mean, this is a perfect storm of a bunch of bad decisions and evil and sin and wrong, and one of those was an attempt to help that ended up hurting, right? And there's that book, When Helping Hurts,
I assume.
Well, when you incentivize if you further incentivize the breakdown of the family, when you further incentivize fatherless homes, and by the way, this is not just an affliction of the African American community. I am not saying that at all.
Right.
Where you actually see that right now is in socioeconomic divides.
Well, we've been talking about that extensively since about 2016 with Hillbilly Elegy and everything. The revelation that there are whole components of the white community in the United States that are just breaking down and undergoing this degradation and extreme, poverty and breakdown of the family and all the social ills that go with that.
Yeah. And so you put all this together, and then, so what explains this week? You have this kind of, perfect storm of conditions on the back end. And then you have this awful, awful video. You have a context in which an awful, awful video like this immediately goes viral and everyone sees it in the blink of an eye. And then you have communities that have been socially isolated for, however many weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not okay. That was that's another commentary that we have coming out this coming week, that we're seeing now some of the results of mental health issues with social lockdowns. And then you have agitators, and there's no way to ignore the fact that there are opportunistic agitators, some anarchists, some white supremacists, though that doesn't seem to be nearly as big of a factor, just given the fact that you can almost total up all those in 4 mothers' basements. But they exist. And then you've got this condition where we are blind to systemic evils. You put it all together. You can't explain this by right and left. Retreating to the political corners is actually going to guarantee that we're going to misunderstand this issue, or this set of issues, and this whole scenario, this scene that we have. And that's going to shade, the answer to the question about which picture is going to, shape this event. It's going to be, it may be a picture that comes out even this week. It may be a picture that comes out by the time, in between the time we record this and the time somebody listens to it on Saturday.
Well, I can't say anything better than that, John. So I think we'll move on to our last story here of the week. I want to talk about what's going on in Hong Kong right now, because I think we were talking about pictures that capture moments in history. And right now, there's a moment in history going on in Hong Kong that it seems likely to me we will remember as momentous. And it coincides with the remembrance of another moment in history, which is the Tiananmen Square massacre on June 4th in 1989. And there was actually the government of China has made a move now to ban gatherings to commemorate Tiananmen Square in Hong Kong. So on top of everything else that's going on there, the suppression of pro-democracy protests, the suppression of religious liberty, and now this new law that's coming down the pike that would crack down and more or less ban the kind of activism we've seen in Hong Kong, or make it extremely difficult. Now we have the government is even forbidding the commemoration of Tiananmen Square. And it's extremely eerie, because what's going on in Hong Kong right now is so reminiscent of what went on in Tiananmen Square during the pro-democracy protest leading up to that massacre, and that moment we all remember when the anonymous tank man, whose fate is completely unknown, stood there in front of the tank and refused to move, and became a symbol of the oppression of the Chinese government.
We have been talking about this over and over and over, and we've got plenty of things to pay attention to on our own shores. Like you said, it's as bad as we've seen in our lifetime. I think that's not an understatement. And yet, in another part of the world, this continues. And it's easy to forget that this is it was almost like there was a timeout or a halftime to this whole story because of COVID-19 coming out of China, and now the opportunism of the Chinese government again, and seizing what they do, right, which is a control of mobility, a control of national memory, a control of history. This is why history
not forget,
is so
it is
important.
illegal. It is illegal to talk about the demonstrations in '89 in China.
I mean, so you look and say how bad things are here, and we should say things are bad here, but they could be, even worse. If folks are concerned about, certain sorts of government injustice, and everyone who's listened to me knows that I at least have concern about TSA. Oh, no. There it is. I snuck it in. Did you like how I did that?
I think you've snuck TSA into every single broadcast we've done.
It's my goal. John. It's and I'm actually quite proud of how successful I've been at this.
I hope you're winning a bet with someone for that.
No, it's just scratching my own itch. That's all. No, look, what's happening in Hong Kong is a violation of what was supposed to be a 50-year agreement. It is fueled a little bit by a group of people who believe that their conscience belongs to something higher than Xi Jinping. You have a resurrection, a reincarnation, in a sense, of Chairman Mao and the ideology and the behavior of Xi Jinping. This is going to get worse before it gets better, tragically. I know we're praying as we should for our country. We're praying for justice and peace, and we need to direct some of those prayers for our neighbors in Hong Kong, as well as especially the brothers and sisters. We don't have time to get into that right now, but we'll link to a couple of Breakpoint commentaries, particularly that were researched and written by Roberto Rivera about the Christian roots of this issue. And so make no mistake that you don't see religion as the headline of these protests or the Chinese crackdown in Hong Kong. You see it obviously with Muslim Uyghurs and underground Christians of underground churches, but that's a big part of this story as well.
Well, folks, we're out of time for today. I hope we've helped make sense of a confusing time for you here. That's our goal, and we want to glorify Christ in our conversation here about the stories of the week. Come to breakpoint.org for articles, links to everything we've talked about today on the program. For John Stonestreet and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next week.